So in the last video, we left off with the temptation of Jesus, and after this, he returns to Judea to begin his ministry. And for about 3 years, he's traveling around and gathers his disciples around him, and the followers of Jesus obviously are going to be significant in number, and he's going to be one of the sort of leading reform rabbis, not reform in the modern sense, but reforming rabbis of his time. Now, obviously, the end of the story is the most important part, and it's the part we're going to focus on today. It's the last week when he returns to Jerusalem. And the entrance into Jerusalem begins something called Holy Week, or the Passion, or Easter Week, which leads us up to, obviously, the crucifixion on Friday and then the resurrection on Sunday. And so this culminates with Easter, the most sacred day of the year for Christians, obviously with the resurrection and what that means, the sacredness of the resurrection. But it begins actually with Jesus going into Jerusalem the Sunday before. So this is a week before the resurrection. It is referred to by Christians as Palm Sunday. It is a reference to what happens, as you'll see here. So as Jesus comes into Jerusalem, at this point, he's obviously well known. He's a teacher, rabbi. If you look at the priests in the upper right, you see they've got long beards. Those would have been the Sadducees, the assimilated Greek-influenced leaders of the temple. You can see up at the back what looks like a church, which would have been the Jewish temple. They didn't know too much about Jewish temples in Renaissance Italy, so they're making it up. But you can see the placing of garments and things in front of him. So from the text, as you can see, a very great multitude spread their garments in the way, others cut down branches from the trees and strawed them in the way. And the multitudes that went before and that followed cried, saying, Hosanna to the Son of David, blessed is he that cometh in the name of the Lord, Hosanna in the highest, like glory in the highest. Now, remember, David was a military leader, and Jesus is appearing on a donkey, and this is not the sign of a military leader. Jesus is not coming to overthrow the Romans, much to the dismay of many of the Jews. And so, obviously, the more radical zealots would have not been particularly happy about this. Or if he is trying to overthrow the Romans, he's not trying to do it in sort of in-your-face type of way. If you look at the number of disciples there behind Jesus, you'll have to take my word for it. There are 11 of them, and you'll notice a door there because Judas has already gone to betray Jesus. According to the story, early on that week, he goes to the temple authorities and basically says that Jesus is betraying the temple, the Jews, and the Romans. So this is the entrance into Jerusalem, but it's important. The people see him as a king, as their king, as the successor of David. And this is important in the Jewish lineage, for sure. Here you can see more closely the door, the depictions of the people. Another depiction of it from Giotto, not quite as expressive as the other one. Now, right after this, Jesus goes to the temple. And Jesus went to the temple of God and cast them all out that sold and bought in the temple, and overthrew the tables of the money changers and the seats of them that sold doves. And he said unto them, it is written, my house shall be called a house of prayer, but ye have made it into a den of thieves. Now this is important because, remember, here Jesus is attacking the people selling the offerings. So he's attacking the corruption of the temple. If you remember, the temple was the place where everybody was going to make sacrifices. And this is where people were buying the things for the sacrifice. And he's not just attacking the whole idea of paying money to make a sacrifice, which obviously there's a whole class component to that, because if you're richer, you can make a nicer sacrifice. That's not the only thing that he's criticizing here. He's criticizing the entire way that the temple is being run. So he is challenging the Sadducees. And if you look at this picture here, right, Jesus is wielding a knife. And it's a knife not all that different from what the Sicarii, and if you remember, the Sicarii were the radical zealots. So this is evidence, if you were looking for it, that Jesus is a little bit more violent in his approach. He's not just sort of peacefully going into Jerusalem, he is radically challenging the upper class Jews. He's challenging the collaboration with Rome. He's putting himself against a lot of different people. So this is kind of the mood of the week. There's a lot of tension in Jesus's own group. There is obviously a lot of tension in and around the temple. So this is the backstory to what's going to happen later. So we get to Thursday night and we get to the Last Supper. And remember, he invites the 12 disciples to eat with him. And he says to them, verily I say to you, one of you who is eating with me will betray me. And they began to be sorrowful and say to him one by one, is it me? And others said, is it me? Or is it I? And he answered and said to them, it is one of the 12 that dippeth with me into the dish. And so if you look at this, it's interesting. He that dippeth into the dish. So here you can see he's holding the bread out and pointing at Judas, who's across the way in the orange robe. But if you look at what's on the table here, right, the wine and the unleavened bread, what was this Last Supper? This Last Supper, or the First Communion, right, which they're going to take the blood and body of Jesus. They're going to transform the most sacred of the Jewish traditions into something else. And this is really the beginning of the transformation from Judaism to Christianity. This is a Passover Seder. The reason that he's in Jerusalem in the first place is to go for Passover. That's where you go. You go to the temple to make your sacrifice. And this is a Passover Seder. So what's interesting about this is that the Passover Seder, as you remember, is the dinner that commemorates the escape from Egypt, the freeing of the Jews, and the giving of the law. So the New Testament, or the new law, is being given here for the first time. Although it's not clear whether or not Jesus means it for it to be a New Testament, or whether it's just a Passover Seder with symbolism. So when Jesus gets to the key part of the ceremony, he says, and as they ate, Jesus took the bread and blessed it and broke it and gave it to them and said, take, eat, this is my body. And he took the cup, and when he had given thanks, he gave it to them, and they all drank from it. And he said to them, this is my blood of the New Testament, which is shed for many. The New Testament, the new law, it's shed for all of you. So the interpretation here is the blood that I am going to shed in my own sacrifice will be to redeem all of you and all of the followers of Christianity going forward. So this obviously is a transformation of the Seder. Also, it suggests that Jesus knows what's coming. So the story from there moves very rapidly, and obviously in real time, just as you want to look at biblical time sometimes symbolically, it's very hard to believe that Jesus would have had the Last Supper on Thursday night. He would also have been tried by the Sanhedrin on Thursday night. All of these things are going to have to happen. First of all, though, he is going to go and in Gethsemane speak to God and basically ask whether or not, basically this cup can be taken from him. He sort of has this moment of doubt and finally says, thy will be done, accepts his fate. And shortly after that, in the Garden of Gethsemane, Judas betrays Jesus. And it's interesting. While he was speaking, Judas, one of the 12, arrived. With him was a large crowd armed with swords and clubs. Those would be the Romans, sent by the chief priests and the elders of the people, right? Sent by the Jewish priests. Now the betrayer had arranged a signal with them. The one I kiss is the man. Arrest him. Going at once to Jesus, Judas said, greetings, Rabbi, and kissed him, right? And then Jesus says, do what you came for, friend, right? So still loving Judas even as Judas betrays him. So again, the idea of being betrayed with a kiss. It's interesting that you'll see another picture there of one of Jesus's followers cutting off one of the Romans' ears. That's important because, again, suggests that there were certainly zealots within Jesus's own own crowd. And perhaps one of the reasons that Judas betrays Jesus is because Jesus was not perhaps radical enough. That's one interpretation that people have sought with this. Actually, I think that the Giotto depiction of this betrayal is even better because it's more intimate and personal. So that night, Jesus is tried by the Sanhedrin. These are leaders of the Jewish temple, and they are a group that is going to find him guilty, and he's going to be found guilty, at least by the Jews, of blasphemy, because he claims, or at least his followers claim, that he's the Son of God. This is not something that Jews accept. One cannot be the sole Son of God by definition. That is blasphemy. That violates the commandment of having no other gods before me. And so this obviously is a religious sin. But it is not the Jews that put Jesus to death. It's the Romans. He goes to Pilate, and Pilate tries to give him an out. Pilate was, by all historical accounts, a real tough bastard. I mean, just brutal, loved crucifying people. Jesus was certainly not the only one. And this trial before Pilate, ultimately, it's interesting. Pilate goes to the Jews and he says, basically asks Jesus if he is king of the Jews, right? And Jesus says, that's what you say, right? That's not what I'm not claiming this. That's what you guys are claiming. And finally, what Pilate does is he says, now at the feast, the governor meaning Pilate, was able to release to the people a prisoner if they wanted to. And they had another notable prisoner called Barabbas. Therefore, when they were gathered together, Pilate said to the Jewish crowd, "Who shall I release to you, Barabbas or Judas? Barabbas or Jesus, which is called Christ?" And the crowd calls for Barabbas to be released. The crowd, most likely being zealots, the idea perhaps is that Barabbas was a little bit more radical than Jesus was, and they preferred him. I think what's important here is this is where the whole idea of the Jews killed Jesus comes from. And this is extremely important because this is the justification for a lot of anti-Semitism. This idea that the Jews killed Jesus because Pilate left it up to the Jews and the Jews basically instructed the Romans to do this. But the crucifixion is not a Jewish punishment. It is clearly a Roman one. The Jews don't crucify people. The Romans do this. And Jesus is not being crucified for being a blasphemer. He's being crucified for treason in that he's opposing the Roman authorities. So this is a Roman punishment. It's interesting that the early Christians blame the Jews because this is clearly a way to differentiate the new religion from the old one. But it's also a way, unfortunately, to justify an awful lot of actions against Jewish people going forward. So finally, we get to the crucifixion. He's crucified between two other common criminals. You notice that one of them turns his head towards him, another one turns his head away from them. The one with the head towards them is where all the saints usually are. It's usually where the apostles are. It's where Mary is. It's where Mary Magdalene is. And all the ones on the right are the Sanhedrin. They're the ones that are going to go to hell. So usually when you see the crucifixion, to be on the right hand of God means that you're on the side that he's blessing. And if you're on the left-hand side of God, you're on the side that is going to be damned. And so we begin to get into the beginning of blessings and damnation. So again, two zealots on either side of him, one on the right, one on the left. And Jesus said, "Father, forgive them," right? "The people crucifying me, for they do not know what they do." And they parted, right? They took his clothes and they picked things to indicate who was going to get what after he gets crucified. So again, Jesus is going to basically to say, you can still save yourself if you believe in me, right? You can even be saved at the very last moment of your life. So I'm not going to get to the resurrection quite yet, but we end with the crucifixion. Obviously, the crucifixion is just a means to the resurrection, which is the final part of the story. Happens 3 days later. We could talk more about the resurrection, and perhaps I will in a separate video, but that basically gets you through the end of Holy Week from the Palm Sunday at the beginning to Easter and the resurrection the